Welcome back. This is the second video in the series. We'll cover John Stuart Mill, the successor to and most influential utilitarian after Jeremy Bentham. If you don't know who Jeremy Bentham is, I've put the link to the previous video in the description. Mill created substantial developments, and we'll dive into chapters 2 and 4 of his essay conveniently titled Utilitarianism. For all utilitarians, we have these three essential qualities that I like to use to summarize the values of the ethical system. Utilitarianism is consequentialist, meaning that only the results matter. It is hedonistic, meaning the only valuable thing is happiness or pleasure, both of these meaning the same thing. And it demands impartiality, which means that no one is morally special, so all individuals are counted as equals in respect to the pleasure gained and lost. The main point of chapter 2 is to dismiss confusions, and by doing so, show how these essential qualities work together. It's kind of a long, boring list, but we're going to go through it to make sure that we don't misunderstand anything. So, utility doesn't mean useful in this philosophical context. This is about pleasure and freedom from pain. Mill also asserts that everything that is desirable at all is so either for the pleasure inherent in it or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and prevention of pain. Happiness is the ultimate end, which means all actions are building to this final goal. Mill thinks that everything we do is for the sake of either tranquility or excitement, each of which are the components of the satisfied life. The requirements for this are mental cultivation and unselfishness. Self-sacrifice is not only acceptable, but it's encouraged. Utilitarianism is about the good of the many, not the good of the one. The caveat is that the sacrifice itself is not seen as good. It's the ultimate result that's good. The sacrifice itself is simply necessary to achieve the result. Mill specifically cites Jesus with the quote, "Do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself." Utilitarianism is impossibly difficult. This isn't a real objection. Good ethics is supposed to be difficult. Our job is to see how good we can be. Utilitarianism is cold and calculated. There's no obligation for you to only be interested in other people for utilitarian purposes. You don't need to view people as solely creatures that you need to make happy. Utilitarianism is godless. While Bentham was an atheist, Mill is not. Mill implies that God is a utilitarian. If it is true that God desires the happiness of his creatures above all else, and that this was his purpose in creating them, then utilitarianism, far from being a godless doctrine, is the most deeply religious of them all. Utilitarianism is concerned with short-term expediency. Utilitarianism is not about short-term results. Lying might get you what you want in the moment, but it's a poor strategy long-term. Utilitarianism is concerned with the long-term results. Utilitarianism is impractical to calculate. Prudence is demanded everywhere, and no one needs to calculate whether murder or theft is harmful to human happiness as if it were a new concept every moment. Bad faith. Plenty of people will assume an ethics system based on happiness will automatically corrupt anyone. But you'll find this everywhere and in everything. People are jerks regardless of the ethical system. Finally, higher and lower pleasures. Higher and lower pleasures is presented in chapter 2 as if it were just dismissing a confusion, but this is in fact a full-fledged and contentious addition to Bentham's original description. The development is that some pleasures are qualitatively higher than others. Higher pleasures are pleasures derived from our rational faculties, so they are intellectual in nature, such as poetry, opera, or philosophy. Lower pleasures are derived from our animal faculties, so they are carnal or bodily in nature, such as food, sex, and alcohol. All these examples are pleasurable, but the type of pleasure matters in a unique way in Mill's system. Bentham thinks that higher pleasures are better because they're more permanent, safer, and less costly. Mill thinks that those perks are nice, but instead says the intellectual pleasures are categorically better, simply because they are intellectual. Let's say you're unjustly in jail, and you're waiting for a shipment of poison to show up because that's what they're going to use for your execution. It might be hard to be happy in this situation, but not everything has been taken away from you. Sure, the environment is rough, and your fate is only 3 days away by boat, but those are material goods. What about mental goods? They can't take away your mind, and they can't take away the impact you've left on the world. In the end, you'll still have your dignity, and that alone is a source of happiness. Bentham would say that those mental goods are important because of how they exist even in a scenario like this. However, Mill says they are literally in a different category and lexically prior, like alphabetical order, to the lower pleasures. A quick recap. Mill adds a development. Some pleasures are qualitatively higher than others. This is radically different from Bentham. Bentham is solely concerned about the quantity of pleasure. So this is a debate about quality versus quantity. Mill says it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. The fact that we have higher faculties is better, and any pleasure associated with it is considered immeasurably greater than the lower pleasures. Mill means no one will opt for lower pleasures over higher pleasures. If a pig were locked up in jail waiting to be slaughtered, the pig doesn't have any higher pleasures keeping it happy, but it also doesn't care. It has a very minimal conception about its fate or any injustice that is happening, yet no one would choose to get rid of their mind for the sake of being happy in that scenario. Mill entertains one related objection in this section. Why doesn't everyone choose the higher pleasures? If it were so obvious that higher pleasures are better, why do people ever choose against them? Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes, because they don't have time or opportunity for indulging them. And they addict themselves to lower pleasures, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only pleasures they can get or the only pleasures they can still enjoy. So, what does Mill think we should actually do? Let's pretend there are multiple choices that you could make in some scenario, and those choices will have the following results as expressed on this XY coordinate chart. The Y coordinate represents the higher pleasures, and the X coordinate represents the lower pleasures. Option D has the most lower pleasure, and option A and B are tied for the most higher pleasures. Let's add choice E just under the higher pleasure values of A and B. Bentham would see the total pleasures of 3 lower pleasures and almost 3 higher pleasures and take it. However, Mill thinks this is a mistake. Mill thinks that any amount of higher pleasure is more important. So for Mill, the best options are still either A or B. Mill would choose B. This is because choice B maximizes higher pleasures first, then maximizes lower pleasures second. Remember, Mill doesn't think that lower pleasures are bad. In utilitarianism, all pleasures are good pleasures because they are pleasures. However, like alphabetical order, Mill demands that higher pleasures be considered first. And that's the end of chapter 2. Moving on to chapter 4. In chapter 4, Mill makes a second addition to Bentham in making a second proof. Bentham's first proof simply said that opposing principles struggled not to piggyback off the principle of utility. Mill admits that there can be no direct proof, so he tries an indirect route, using our desire and the desirability of happiness. Here's the quote. The only proof capable of being given that a thing is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it, and so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be obtainable, desires his own happiness. The crux of his argument is that we have an ultimate desire for pleasure in every instance that we desire anything. He covered this partially in Happiness as an Aim in chapter 2, but he continues in more depth in chapter 4. In summary, to think of an object as desirable and to think of it as pleasant are one and the same thing. The most common reason to go to college is to get a degree. But technically, that's just paper. You're not doing this for paper. No, it's because the degree gets you a better job. And why do you want a better job? Well, money's pretty nice. And why do you want money? Probably so you can buy nice stuff. And why do you want the stuff? Because you like it. And that's all there is to it. You just like it. The reason that a student goes to college is because they're convinced it will make them happier in the long run. And Mill thinks this is true of literally anything we do. So, happiness is what's desired, and it's desired because it's the goal of the desirable life. This means that happiness is what is ultimately desirable, and therefore ultimately ethical. Thanks for watching.